Hello, Lauren.
Good morning, Charlie. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. This is a treat to meet with you
Yeah.
all the way across the country or
So
a
are
continent.
you in Canada, British
Yes,
Columbia?
yes, in Vancouver. Just
Excellent.
yeah.
So I've read through your website. I know very basic things about what you do, but I'd love to get some nuts and bolts of Kinbrace's story.
Mhm.
So on your website, it says that Kinbrace is the longest running housing and support provider in British Columbia, and you guys started in 1998. So I'll just set that up as a T. So how did that come about, and where did you jump into the story of it?
Good question. Well, Canada has a fairly well-developed refugee protection system that's
Hmm.
run through its largest independent tribunal called the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. And
Hmm.
it was started in 1988. And it really began to recognize in a serious way the need for care, diligence, and good application of the law in determining claims for refugee protection in the country.
Hmm.
And so Kinbrace started 10 years after that.
Right.
But I would say in the late 80s when the Immigration and Refugee Board was set, that was when there were just a lot of people in the country who were seeking refugee protection. There wasn't a really great system for it, and there wasn't a lot of support for them. And so the reason I go back that far is because my wife was involved in Toronto with an early startup called Matthew House, really providing community and housing for asylum seekers, very grassroots. Started out with one house. And her experience there, she lived in the house, supported people. And it was really one of the first initiatives in Canada, really
Hmm.
addressing the housing needs of refugee claimants. That's the term we use here in Canada is refugee claimant.
I
Um,
saw that a lot on your
yeah,
website.
we do use the term asylum seeker as well, but in our laws, in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the term refugee claimant is used. So that's what we work with.
Gotcha.
So fast forward to 1998, actually 1996, my wife and I got married, and I was going to school out here on the West Coast. She was working in Toronto area as a pastor. We got married. She moved out here. We started attending a little church in East Vancouver called Grandview Church. And it was kind of a podunk little community of very diverse people in every way possible, very grassrootsy, but they had a big vision. And that vision was to respond to the vulnerabilities of people in the neighborhood. And the model that they chose to work with was what they called cluster housing. So just get some houses in the neighborhood and start living together alongside people who are either forgotten or missed or on the street or lonely or whatever it might be, homeless. And so with that vision that was really driven by a gospel understanding of how we're meant to be in the universe,
Hmm.
it was also connected so there's a lot of risk that people were really willing to take, but there was also a family in the congregation and sort of a bit of a long story. They had deep roots in the community almost a century before
Hmm.
and since moved away. But then this one couple started attending that church again after living elsewhere in Canada. And they had family wealth that they wanted to share and invest in the community. So it's kind of this perfect storm of people willing to take risk, a community with a vision and capacity.
Yeah.
And so a small organization was founded to operate separately from the church for quicker decision making. It was called Salisbury Community Society, named after the little street the church is on. And then the brainstorming started to happen. Now what? Let's get going. And I had just graduated with a Master of Divinity degree. My wife had just started working at the church. We were young. We were flexible. And so we were sort of in the swirl of all of this creativity, but also kind of had our own imaginations going. And we were approached, asked what, if you were to start a place that to meet some need with some population, what would it be? And so this was over a lunch with a senior couple who, Howard and Shirley Bental. And my wife just shot right out. She said, refugee claimants. I have experience. We don't know what's happening here in Vancouver, but let's look into it. And so we took a couple weeks to do a deep dive and found out there was no dedicated housing transitional housing for refugee claimants in BC. And so that was Good Friday when that question was launched and we started. And then in May, we went to look at a big house that has an old character home in East Vancouver, about 8 blocks from the church, that had been subdivided into 7 apartments. And so just kind of a beautiful old building with a lovely feel of a home and yet
Mm-hmm.
this capacity to house multiple families, individuals, etc. And then July 1st, so then the Hawthorne Charitable Foundation purchased the house and we moved in July. So this whole thing happened literally within months,
Mm.
which is so unusual for, a good idea to just kind of gain traction that quickly.
Right.
So the whole story is premised abundantly on grace, on gift, on the unexpected, and a huge amount of trust as well. And so we've just always operated with the gift to share the gift. Like we have
Mm.
nothing to protect. Sometimes you go on a long campaign and raise your dollars and you just get so defensive of whatever you built. We've just had this capacity to open our doors to refugee claimants, the people who need housing most in BC. And I mean, many people do need housing, but that's our origin story. And so my wife and I moved in, are the model of this cluster housing, the DNA from, the vision of this congregation, deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition of hospitality and welcome, is to live side by side
Mm.
with refugee claimants. And so that's always been our model. We have what we call the host community who live on the property and in one of the apartments, and then the other 6 were used for transitional housing are used. We subsequently got the property next door with our Hawthorne Foundation purchased it. And so we took down the fence between the properties. We have these 2 lovely joined properties with now a total of 9 units between the 2 houses. So the picture that I'd paint is of, people with their own self-contained units where they can land and sleep literally for as long as they need to when they first get here. The safety of that environment where it's self-contained, little kitchens in every unit, bathrooms, etc. But then they can come out into a wider welcoming community where we have one apartment that's dedicated to community building. So where our little office is, we eat our shared meals there with the community. It's an equal access, 9 in the morning to 9 at night, host parties, whatever. And then lovely backyards that are available for everybody to join in, seasonally as they're available. We've been
Wow.
intentional to plant fruit trees so that there's kind of this, and grapevines, this somehow, and herbs. Interesting stories. We had a rue plant for many years, and for Ethiopians, rue is herb that's used quite widely in the food.
Mm-hmm.
In European lore, it's kind of a distasteful herb, but
Mm.
anyhow, just I remember this one woman who just sat by this bush and she just pinched the leaves and smell it and just took her back to her home, to her country, to her own
Awesome.
deep origin. Yeah. So just trying to make the place as hospitable as possible, a big trampoline in the front yard for the kids. And so that's the origin story, Charlie, and it's all been a gift. And the model is a little bit unique in Canada because a lot of the other transitional housing providers operate out of single family dwellings where
Mm-hmm.
everybody's sharing, say, the same kitchen and the same bathroom. So you don't quite have that independence. Or you move to a much larger, more shelter type model where there's many people living, and then there's like a big common kind of cafeteria type thing.
Right.
We get their meals. So this is the model that we have is really beautiful and we're grateful for it. And it really sets us up for, I think, the articulation, the lived experience that led to the articulation of our 5 core values. And so we have a lot of gift to steward and care for and share
Hmm.
in that context. So I hope that's a helpful
Yeah.
part of story.
It really helps capture a picture for me of what you're doing. It's great. Maybe my first question is like, how do you design the commitment for your host family? Are they staying there for a year, 2 years, or is this just what they do for life? Or
Yeah. So my wife and I were really the first ones to move in, and we lived there for 19 years, which was
wow.
too long. We now, in our sort of our policy around host community, we have a maximum of 7 years as kind of
Hmm.
the outer limit.
Okay.
What's trending is people are staying quite a bit shorter than that. We're in a bit of flux around it. We moved. It used to be a model where the host community were paid. At least one of the partners was paid to be on salary, and then we'd have volunteers come in and help and live there as well. And then we moved to entirely volunteer host community model, and now we're moving away from that because we just find you need people people embedded in the community who are there for a longer term and really need to be managing from the inside
Yeah.
and holding it together at the heart. So we started moving in that direction several months ago. So yeah, we do have a contract that kind of outlines how everybody operates and what their responsibilities are and what the commitment is all about. The current host community is one couple who both have day jobs, but they're there otherwise 24/7. And then there's a single woman from Ireland who's here on a 2-year visa, and
Hmm.
she's yeah, just great. So she's actually paid now to be in the role that she's in. What we know from past experience and are relearning is that host community, they're integral to the goings on there, and they need to understand both the refugee claim process and the people who are living there. Like there just needs to be a deep dive into holding that space together.
Hmm.
So with having it just as volunteers, it created a little bit of a distance that made it felt like we were managing more from the outside in
Yeah.
rather than the life coming from inside the community and being held at the center.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so there's paperwork. If you're interested in getting it, I could, get someone to send that to you. But
Sure.
we try to develop all this stuff the best we can for a healthy community.
My next question is doing that type of community sounds, at least from a North American perspective, or it seems very foreign or ultra communal more than the average person that does life with their normal neighbors. So is the idea treated with a certain level of that's really strange and foreign and glad you're doing that, but I don't want to be a part of that? Or is it more, wow, that's so cool. I want to be a part of this from
Mm,
the outside communities that may be funding
yeah.
you, but they're not participating in it every day.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's a bit of a magnet for people whose hearts and imaginations are inclined in that direction of building transformative communities and being part of that. And there are lots of people like that in the universe.
Hmm.
And so we actually have a problem of too many people wanting to volunteer, and we don't have enough capacity to intake them. And for the host community, it can be a little more tricky to find people who are willing to be and live in that space. But they're out there. And I
Yeah,
think I for myself, I grew up and my wife grew up in East Africa. We were both kids of missionary parents. And so, kind of a unique combination of having grown up in boarding schools and dormitories and
those more communal type
yeah,
settings.
that
Yeah.
type setting. But you know what I think what's deeper, Charlie, is Kinbrace's mandate is to welcome those who are forcibly displaced. And for those people who have a forced displacement story of some sort, or just a general displacement story, or a deep quest to belong and find home and find welcome, which is, I would say, that's what defines my own story growing up as a white kid in Ethiopia, being very welcomed there, but always being a stranger.
Yeah,
Coming to Canada and for many years not knowing where exactly I belonged. So it's something that I encourage everybody to touch base with because sometimes the deepest drivers are just those very basic things of what's been our own experience. Coupled with that is we just have these really, I just find them powerful core values that were articulated from within the community right where the hammer hits the nail,
yeah,
and so they are so genuine and so real. And if your heart, I think they resonate with everybody if you stop to reflect on them. And
sure.
there's a little book that was written. I'm not sure if you came across it when you were perusing the website, but it's called Becoming Neighbors: 5 Values for a World of Welcome, written by a woman who lived in the community for 3 years. So she's Canadian. She was part of the host community family. But I would encourage you to read that because it's such a transformative space. It's a very ambiguous space, and it's fraught with uncertainty. It's fraught with loss and sadness and just massive doses of ambiguity and uncertainty because that forced displacement space, it's a very uncomfortable space. There's very little resolution. It's
Sure.
long periods of time from when a person seeks protection in Canada to when they get their protection to when they get reunited with their family to when they finally feel like they've settled. And so it's a long, long struggle.
Yeah.
And yet, with these core values right at the center of that, where all these sort of this fractious and all these pressures that pull everything apart in forced displacement, these core values gently put it back together again. And the reason I say that is it's a living community. So those who get involved, as soon as they start experiencing that, it doesn't happen on day one. It happens over the course of time, and then you
Right.
realize, oh my gosh. So one, our third core value is mutual transformation, which is we're diverse, lots of different people living in a very tight space together. But as we listen and learn, we change. And it's an amazing journey to be on. So I think there's huge potential for it. And our world is, look at any stats on forced displacement. It's just a climbing chart.
Right.
100 and probably around 130 million right now. And, the US is living, you get so many people coming over that southern border and a few over the northern border. And how do we live together well in the context of migration and movements of people? You can fight against it, you can build your walls, but
Yeah.
it'll never solve anything. But when
No, it
we
won't.
step in and lean in around how do we change and grow together, that's a beautiful space.
Definitely. What types of refugees have you served since 1998?
Like from where they've come
Yeah,
from, or
from wherever they come.
yeah, well, I mean, pretty much wherever there's been an issue globally, that you'll always find people arriving. Various parts of Africa. I mentioned Ethiopia. That was an interesting one for me because I grew up there. And I grew up
Mm,
during the communist revolution. I was born in 68. The revolution happened in 74. And I was a witness to crimes against humanity, to persecution. And I just would hear stories of people who were leaving, and I had no idea. And so to be on this side was a really curious thing for
yeah.
me. Right now in the house, we have a family from Mexico. We have families from Colombia. We have Kurdish people from Iraq. Where else? Recently, we've had other key locations, Afghanistan, and oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank.
Oh, no problem.
But it's basically, yeah, wherever there's a rough spot in the world, and there's always a delay as well of people's movements. And because if something happens, I mean, take example Gaza right now. Like
Yeah.
people are just massively displaced within Gaza, but they can't get out. And
Right.
so then like people keep asking us, are you getting Palestinians from Gaza? No, because they can't get out, right?
Right.
So there's also so many mitigating factors for people seeking safety as well. Yeah.
Right. So you mentioned that your host family has up to 7-year contract to stay in the community. What's the average time that a refugee community or a refugee family stays in your community?
Yeah, good question. So we're set up as a transitional housing community, which means we take people who have arrived recently and are homeless and just need an immediate place. And then it's really between 3 to 6 months that they live in the transitional housing community and then move on to permanent housing.
Okay.
And so that window of time, so there's no perfect amount of time. Ideally, transitional housing is actually a little bit shorter, but the way the refugee claim process is working is taking a long time for people to get their basic refugee claim documents.
Hmm.
And then we have an unprecedented housing crisis here in Canada where the vacancy rate is near zero and
Wow.
the rental rates are just through the roof.
Crazy high.
So
Yeah.
yeah, just trying to find affordable places for people. So, but 3 to 6 months, that's what we aim for. Sometimes it's longer.
Nice. On your website, you have something, it says you designed it, or maybe you utilize it. I'm not sure. myrefugeeclaim.ca.
Hmm.
It seemed really interesting, so explain that to me.
Yeah, well, that is a Kinbrace initiative,
Okay.
and it's really come out of years of living alongside refugee claimants and recognizing how difficult it is for them to access the legal system that they're part of, the refugee determination system. And
Mm,
so my refugee claim is a series of resources that are essentially public legal education and information resources. It all started back in 2008 when we knew that refugee claimants were going to their refugee hearings, but didn't have any idea what the hearing room looked like and who was going to be there and how the event would unfold. And it's the
hmm.
most critical event where they go and they tell their story, and a decision maker from the refugee board makes a decision whether they merit refugee protection or not. I mean, it's an amazing story. I phoned a mentor of mine who had been what we call a board member, a decision maker at the Immigration and Refugee Board. And I said, can you come in and just help the residents here at Kinbrace? We'll do like maybe to do a mock hearing. You can explain the process. And he said, Loren, I have a better idea. he said, we need to get the refugee claimants into the actual hearing rooms at the Immigration and Refugee Board. So they know where they're going, like literally what bus to
Mm-hmm.
take, how to get there, how to go up the elevator, et cetera, et cetera. I got a tingle up and down my spine. I said, that's exactly what we need,
Yeah.
Loren. And so I phoned a lawyer friend of mine who had just taken on a new role with the UNHCR
Mm-hmm.
here in the Western region. And I said, what do you think about this idea? And the UNHCR office was on the same floor as the Refugee Protection Division of the IRB. And yeah, she screamed on the phone. And a couple of months, we had our first what we call ready tour, taking people in. And so that just a nice cadence of getting people more than just Kinbrace's refugee claimants in our housing, but a wider number, getting them into the IRB, getting them
Mm-hmm.
oriented, these sort of psychospatial orientations. And then we learned, we could see that people were really appreciative of that, but then didn't have any information to follow up with. So we wrote a little guide called the Refugee Hearing Preparation Guide that just became very popular across the country. It was PDF version, like an actual printed little booklet.
Mm-hmm.
And the uptake on that was really strong. But then when the pandemic hit, we had just done a major update. Pandemic hit, it affected the way the system operated. And doing updates in these printed booklets was really expensive and very time consuming. So we said we
Mm-hmm.
need to shift this whole thing to web-based information, HTML, which we did. And so now it's a $1.4 million project that we've just
Wow.
completed. And it just launched. We have it in 13 languages, both the website and the orientation booklet. And then the ready tours have gone really strong. So yeah, it's now, I think that the picture I want to paint for you, Charlie, is refugee claimants up until now have really traveled deep down in the weeds on arrival, and they don't know where to get information from. They don't know who to trust. So
Yeah.
they're really vulnerable to misinformation, disinformation, exploitation. And so what my refugee claim does, it kind of creates this handhold way up in the sky for them that they can grab onto and start to look down on their landscape rather than kind of navigate it from only seeing to the end of their nose.
Right.
Now they can see, okay, who can I contact in my city? Like who's available to help me. Plus, so there's the community resources they have access to. Plus, they've got just this whole set of information from start to finish on how the refugee claim process works. And it's been designed very intentionally. So the illustrations are done by a person who volunteered for years as a volunteer with Kinbrace. All the images have been vetted by people with lived experience to make sure that the images aligning with each section of information kind of carry the vibe
Mm-hmm.
much as possible. It's abstract, but so yeah, we're really thankful to to have had the support mainly from law foundations across the country to help build it. But the joy is that there are refugee claimants using it and knowing what to do. They're informed, they're connected, they're prepared. That's our main hope,
Nice.
our dream for them. Yeah.
Do they need a volunteer to walk them through it, or can they just go through it solo?
It's written in plain language. It's completely
Okay.
designed for refugee claimants. But one thing that I will say is that accompaniment is the most powerful way that refugee claimants understand and learn. And so being with somebody who understands the system is a exceptional way for a refugee claimant to understand the
Like a
system.
friend or
Yeah, a
yeah.
friend, somebody who's got a little bit more information and can not give legal advice, but give just encouragement and pointers and I'm with you statements. Yeah.
Nice. That's amazing. That's awesome. Different question or different topic. So your website says that you can house maybe 30 to 40 claimants at a time in your temporary housing. How do you navigate different cultures of different or languages of different refugees that are staying in your community at the same time?
Yeah. Well, that's a day by day opportunity for sure. We have a settlement team who come in daily to support the community, and that's three people. And one of those people speaks Farsi, Dari. Another person speaks Spanish. Both of them have lived refugee claimant experience. So they not only bring the language capacity, but they bring the lived experience
Yeah, the lived
capacity as well.
experience. It's good.
Yeah. And we have, an on-call phone interpreter. There's a company based in Ontario that we use. That we generally use that for really important conversations where information needs to be passed or there's a critical conversation happening.
Exact information or
Yeah, yeah.
sensitive. Yeah.
Sensitive. But there's also a lot of communication that happens that's just very human hellos, postures. I don't speak any other language, but I'm Herrick. And so I'm, a bit of a dud in the community, but it's still, you eat together, you play games together, you
That's
shake
awesome.
hands, you hug, whatever it is. There's ways of, extending hospitality and journeying together. Also, just trying to learn somebody else's language is a good step in the right direction to community building,
Yeah.
even though it's often a fail, at least for me.
But we try.
We try.
How do you help the claimants integrate into the greater community outside of your temporary housing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's an ongoing question because the relationships that are formed there, they go deep fairly quickly,
Yeah.
just because of the proximity.
Right.
We do encourage people to connect to their faith tradition communities, whatever that might be, if they're inclined to that. We had an initiative running called Beyond Refuge for a couple of years, and then we ran out of funding. But the whole thing there was to spark relationships beyond the Kinbrace community, just to essentially get people connected. And we didn't quite have the right model, and we ran out of funding, and it didn't go too far. But it's both a gift and a curse because the trust that's built in that they're in people's first days in Canada in a welcoming community like Kinbrace, they go on and on for years. So that's a gift. The curse a little bit is that people will come back
Hmm.
because of that trust when the problem arises. So we work very intentionally to try to connect them. Let's say once they move from Kinbrace and they're living 30 kilometers away in another city, what are the settlement agencies in that area? So we'll do a personal handover to a settlement worker
That's
in that
good.
new community. Yeah. So we'd make every effort we can to make sure people are connected beyond the Kinbrace community.
I think this might be my last official question, but what can't you do now that you'd like to do in the future?
Well, that's a great question. The thing that comes to the top of my mind, what I'd like to do now is what we did way at the beginning, which we can't do now, which I'd like to do in the future, and that is have affordable housing for people to move into.
Yeah.
So in our neighborhood in East Vancouver back in 1998, there was just lots of apartment buildings that were accessible, affordable all around us. Now they've all been gentrified and
Hmm.
they're $3,000 for a one-bedroom apartment compared to back in the day when they were like $600. And so I just love housing that people
Yeah.
can move into and really start thriving. That's one thing. I would love more communities of welcome for
Hmm.
refugee claimants. And we have it in our own strategic vision to do that. But it's easier said than done, just the cost of land and that sort of a thing.
Right.
Yeah, our vision is a world of welcome. We have the gift of making that happen day by day in the Kinbrace community and being aware of what you're doing there and these little pockets. But it would be great if the whole country and our countries somehow found a way to create a world of welcome rather than a world of hostility and barriers.
Hmm. I thought of another last question. So in Chicago or South Chicago, Northwest Indiana, we have one house that's similar to what you're describing. And then we are raising the funding for a second house. We have 3 units of different claimants that we serve. They stay between around a year to a year and a half in our house while we help them with their asylum case. And then we try to help them move on. So I guess my question for you is in our stage, and we've only been around for 10 years, and we have a legal clinic that provides assistance to around 150 different types of individuals or families every year. What types of encouragement could you give to our board, our staff, our volunteer base to continue this work of being a community of welcome for vulnerable people?
Yeah, well, first of all, way to go. That your legal clinic idea is something that we're talking about seriously here. So would love to learn from you more about that. I think one of the gifts we've had that I would encourage people to think about, there's two things. One is having a really clear mandate of who you're helping.
Hmm.
Because in immigrant welcoming and refugee welcoming countries like the US and Canada, there's so many different kind of avenues for people to come in.
Niches or yeah.
Yeah. And but each of them globally, they all have newcomer needs and opportunities in front of them. But uniquely, each of those pathways has their own issues and their own unique challenges and whatever. And so for us, focusing only on refugee claimants has it's limited us in some ways because there's needs with resettled refugees and there's
Mm,
all sorts of other kind of needs out there. But having a just a pinpoint focus on this population, I think has given us the capacity to really dive deep and create things like the My Refugee Claim
mm,
resources. I see other organizations, settlement organizations who they're really large and they're serving all these various populations
mm,
and they're sometimes susceptible to the funding opportunities that are out there. And so they'll kind of shift focus a little bit. But because they've got such wide mandates, it always seems to work and it matters. But the challenge is you create really short memories in that type of a system. And
mm,
so really clear, like really knowing who you're helping. And even with refugee claimant, they become protected persons or convention refugees, and then they still have some of the issues of refugee claimants, but they also have a lot more security because they still don't have permanence. They have to get their permanent residence, so that's a
right,
whole other process. So it's this continuum of support. And we never know exactly where to stop helping people because we want to help and we know their story. But our Tuesday evening dinners, which is a community dinners at Kinbrace, it was kind of a small example of the dangers of mandate drift.
yeah,
Because we started having lots of people wanting to come to the Tuesday dinner because it was a place to belong and it was felt.
right,
And so we said, okay, what are we here for? And so very specifically, we said we're here. Tuesday dinners exist to welcome the newest refugee claimant among us. So it's pointed right at that front door
yeah,
of the community. There's massive belonging needs in the middle, out the back door. Everybody
sure,
needs a community to belong to. But if we're not all focused on that one singular thing. So I guess that's one comment to your community because it looked like you're working with a wider range. You're working with asylum
sure,
seekers and other newcomers, and it's something to be mindful of.
yeah,
And then I think the other thing is we've really had this gift of being able to articulate these five core values. And so really to understand where's the articulation of your values coming from? I
mm,
think the more that is living and breathing part of the community and you're reflecting on them every day, and they're both a call forward and like they're calling us from the outside, but they're also coming out of us from the inside. That's when I think core values are actually alive.
yeah,
So just being mindful of that as a community,
yeah.
those would be my two encouragements.
Awesome. I love that word. And thank you so much.
Mm.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And I hope that this interview is a benefit to the people that will hear it or watch it.
Oh, well, thank you, Charlie.